Africa is in the past, present, and future plans of the Beijing government. The Chinese government has never forgotten its plans in Africa, but in recent years, it has had to focus more on controlling its own economy. First, the outbreak of the global pandemic, with China closing its borders for almost 4 years. Then the fall of Evergrande, considered by most to be too big to fail, but whose disastrous collapse brought down the entire Chinese real estate market, which plunged 12% from its peaks during the period between 2020 and 2021. But now the cooperation program between China and Africa has restarted. However, the data reveals a more complex relationship between China and Africa compared to Beijing's historical effort to consolidate the Belt and Road Initiative for the expansion of China's trade network. Africa is a poor continent in search of financial resources, and having received weak support from the World Bank, it looked around and found a great ally in China, willing to lend billions of dollars and bring its expertise directly to the region. China has thus developed roads, ports, railways, military bases, extraction sites, and energy industries in Africa. The end result has been the consolidation of the construction of massive infrastructure projects distributed across the African continent in exchange for a mountain of debt that African states will struggle to repay to China. But the narrative of China building the BRI is only part of the story. What we know is that China's plans usually manifest in the long term. So the question is, what are China's true plans for the African continent? In 2013, President Xi Jinping proposed that China would create a Silk Road economic belt across Central Asia and Europe, and a 21st century maritime Silk Road running through the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean onto the Middle East and Europe. An ambitious plan has seen China commit to building all kinds of infrastructure to construct the famous Silk Road. African countries, in need of funds to economically develop the continent, first turned to the World Bank. But when the conditions were too stringent and the magnitude of the loans was insufficient to meet the continent's needs, they turned to the only country that came to their aid, offering a gigantic amount of financing and investments: China. Thus, China has developed a large number of projects in Africa, specifically involving ports, roads, and railways, totaling over 200 infrastructure projects built or financed by China in Africa from 2013 to the present. This includes over 30,000 kilometers of roads, 2,000 kilometers of railways, and more than 50 ports, as well as numerous extraction plants spread across the continent. But let's pause for a moment and bring some order to this. Where have these major projects been built, and more importantly, why? When we look at African infrastructure projects that have seen Chinese involvement, the strategy becomes very clear. The first step was to build large extraction plants to exploit the continent's mineral wealth. Next, they constructed major infrastructure projects like roads and railways to connect these large plants to the most strategic points on the continent, the coasts. Finally, they developed commercial ports with access to the Indian and Atlantic Oceans to strengthen and extend China's trade network around the world. In particular, there are 3 areas where China has focused the most. The first is West Africa, which directly faces the Atlantic Ocean, providing open access to trade routes connecting Africa with the European and American continents. The second area is East Africa, which faces the Indian Ocean with its trade routes linking Africa to the Asian continent. And finally, the third area is the Red Sea, particularly along one of the world's most important strategic points, the choke point of Bab el-Mandeb, where China has also decided to build a military base in Djibouti state. This is of primary importance to have direct influence over the maritime traffic of the Suez Canal, which connects Asia with Europe. Africa has become a significant development point for Chinese trade routes, a focal point for consolidating the role of Xi Jinping's country as the world's leading exporter. Beyond exports, the relationship between China and Africa also hinges on another significant factor: a substantial financial bond between China and Africa. Indeed, the construction of these major projects does not come without consequences for the African countries involved. Between 2000 and 2022, Chinese financiers provided estimated loans to sovereign borrowers in Africa totaling $170 billion, of which $134 billion were provided by the two main Chinese development finance institutions, the Export-Import Bank of China and the China Development Bank. Chinese lending has frequently been linked with the concept of debt trap diplomacy. This term originated from an Indian research organization in 2017 and spread across Western governments, media outlets, and intelligence circles. It implies that China might utilize its loans to trap African nations in unsustainable debt loads, potentially resulting in a loss of their sovereignty. Loans from China differ from those provided by Western institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. According to research conducted by Data, Chinese state-owned lenders, motivated by profit considerations, often impose conditions in loan agreements that could strain already fragile African economies. These conditions may include restrictions on collective restructuring and the inclusion of extensive confidentiality clauses. Such terms may restrict the ability of borrowing nations to make independent and sovereign financial decisions. Thus, China has not only secured commercial expansion by dominating the trade routes originating from Africa, but it has also potentially gained significant influence in the political decisions of the continent. However, while the amount of loans extended to African sovereigns has made China the continent's largest bilateral creditor, the issuance of loans by Chinese lenders has steadily declined since its peak in 2016. Current debt burdens and the rising cost of loans leave little room for additional borrowing. Indeed, with many African nations facing the threat of a debt crisis, Chinese banks will prioritize fiscal stabilization over initiating fresh projects. Even according to the IMF, the problem is real. These are 21 African nations either in or at high risk of debt distress. After these large investments by Chinese banks in the continent and the economic and political instability that characterizes African countries, the concrete risk is that these debts may never be repaid to Chinese banks, considering the heavy burdens these loans impose on African countries. Then the negotiations regarding debt restructuring and relief between China and a few debt-burdened countries such as Angola, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Zambia are expected to continue for several years. Drawing from its experiences and insights gained from debt restructuring, China is expected to reassess its lending approach in Africa, but not abandon its strategy on the continent. Indeed, during the 2023 BRICS summit in South Africa, Chinese officials emphasized a desire to collaborate with African nations on industrialization, signaling both a continuation and a nuanced alteration of past policies. Given that infrastructure in certain African nations has been largely underutilized, China aims to enhance productivity by incorporating industrial elements into infrastructure projects. China has found, through its own experience, that the symbiosis between industrialization and infrastructure is crucial for fostering sustainable economic growth and societal change. Therefore, the transition from infrastructure to industrialization represents a shift in emphasis rather than a complete departure. However, industrial investments will not come from loans, but rather from private enterprises. Xi Jinping's goal is to focus more on an alternative form of investment: public-private partnerships, or PPPs. China has described PPPs as the new preferred investment vehicle globally, but they have yet to gain significant traction on the continent. But let's recap the situation for a moment. China has invested billions of dollars in building large infrastructure projects and extractive industries across the continent. Now it faces the risk of losing billions of dollars in loans that may never be repaid due to the political and economic instability of African countries. And despite this, China continues to invest in the continent, supporting private investments. Before moving on to the next chapter, we remind you to leave a like and subscribe to Vision Economy to stay updated on the most important trends and narratives in the global economy. The question that arises is what drives China to risk so much in Africa, beyond the well-known narrative of the Belt and Road Initiative. The answer is not singular. There are indeed two main advantages that China can secure with its presence in Africa. The first is intertwined with China's global industrial ambitions, as evidenced by recent Chinese investments in Africa. According to the Griffith Asia Institute at Australia's Griffith University, new Chinese investment in Africa surged by 114% last year. This investment was predominantly directed towards minerals crucial for the global energy transition and China's strategies to rejuvenate its slowing economy, while the bond regarding oil has not strengthened at all. This shift in exports is directly related to China's strategy to enhance its high-tech industry. This strategy already sees China dominating in the production of electric vehicles, turbines, and robots globally. To become a global leader in the technology sector, China needs to secure sufficient mineral resources to enable the growth of its industry, and Africa represents the ideal territory to secure these resources. This link is further confirmed when we look at the trade relationship, with China being Africa's primary bilateral partner. From 2001 to 2021, 89% of African exports to China were in the extractive sector, primarily involving oil. Although China's oil demand is still growing, this growth is declining and has reached 3.9% in 2023. As a direct consequence, oil imports from Africa are decreasing as China increasingly sources crude oil from the more predictable production infrastructure of Gulf Cooperation Council countries, Russia, and other countries in Asia. The value of crude oil imports from non-African countries is decreasing significantly in the period between 2019 and 2023. African exports to China are changing. While the majority of exports used to consist of oil, China is now primarily importing mineral resources and metals. But from this changed relationship, Africa is emerging with an increasingly negative trade balance. Africa's trade deficit has widened, rising to $64 billion from $46.9 billion in 2022, as China registered a decrease in imports of about 7%, amounting to $109 billion, while exporting goods worth $173 billion. To tackle the trade disparity, Beijing has committed to increasing its imports from Africa by establishing eco-friendly corridors for African agricultural exports and granting greater access to African products in the Chinese market without tariffs. During the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Johannesburg in August, Chinese President Xi Jinping assured African leaders that China would intensify efforts to rectify the trade imbalance, including assisting African nations in boosting food production and establishing local processing industries. An agreement that represents a win-win for both parties, with Africa relying on China as a destination for its food production, and China, the world's second most populous country, securing food for its own population. The outcome is a more unbalanced relationship than China claims to desire, one that is dominated by the import of Africa's raw materials and, according to some analysts, bears similarities to the economic ties Europe had with the continent during the colonial era. But the opportunities for China in Africa are not over here. China has taken control of Africa's infrastructure and mining resources, but there is another reason that has brought China to Africa. In fact, there is a second reason Africa, which currently represents over 16% of the world's population, is expected to grow to 10.9 billion by 2100 according to ONU estimates, becoming the most populous continent in the world. It will even represent almost 40% of the population. The rapid growth will bring with it a large segment of young populations seeking employment, a need that is difficult for struggling African countries to manage, and it is precisely here that China intends to fill a void that no other country in the world is targeting with such intensity. Complicit geopolitical tensions, which have prompted some Chinese manufacturers to expedite efforts to relocate outside of China. These outward investments have primarily targeted countries in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Europe as gateways to the US market. Africa could represent the next destination for Beijing's ambitions as labor costs in China and Southeast Asia continue to rise. Some Chinese investors may contemplate relocating production facilities to Africa, where wages are considerably lower. From cement, plastics, and pharmaceuticals to beauty products, mobile devices, and electric vehicles, Chinese entrepreneurs have recently established a diverse array of manufacturing plants on the continent to satisfy the needs of a growing middle class in Africa. So consolidating its position as the world's leading manufacturing industry by exploiting excess and low-cost labor from developing African countries. The result of this relationship between China and Africa is an increasingly skewed dynamic favoring China's economic advantage over African countries. However, Africa is not the only continent at the center of geopolitical tensions and global economic interests. Europe, too, finds itself in the midst of a major global intrigue, with a likely trade war that could soon impact the old continent, bringing significant implications for the growth prospects of major Western countries. If you want to learn more, click here and we'll see you in the next video.